The air inside the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Peregrine was a finite and precious resource, recycled to the point of tasting metallic and thin. It was a cocktail of odors: the sharp, sterile bite of ozone from the server racks that lined the far wall like silent monolithic sentinels, the lingering ghost of burnt coffee brewed thick and bitter hours ago, the faint, ever-present scent of diesel fuel that clung to every uniform and seeped through every canvas flap of the tent city. And beneath it all, the finest particles of the Afghan dust, a talcum-like grit that worked its way into everything, from the gears of a rifle to the delicate circuits of a drone's motherboard. The only light came from the cold, blue-white glare of 24 monitors, their glow casting long, dancing shadows that made the men and women within look like ghosts, haunting their own machinery. The only sound was the constant, pervasive hum of electronics, a low thrum that vibrated up through the soles of one's boots, a mechanical mantra of perpetual vigilance. It was a place outside of time, a sealed bubble of frantic, controlled purpose dropped into the middle of a vast and indifferent wilderness of rock and sand. In this pressurized sanctuary of data and command, Master Sergeant Frank Miller was king. His throne was a slightly more padded swivel chair positioned at the nexus of the communications hub, a vantage point from which he could survey his entire kingdom of blinking lights and whispering fiber optics. Miller was a man carved from the very granite of institutional tradition. His jaw was a firm, uncompromising line. His posture was a ramrod of disciplined pride, and the creases around his eyes were not from laughter, but from years of squinting at distant horizons and subordinate inadequacies. He wore his uniform not as clothing, but as a second skin, each crease and fold a testament to his unwavering belief in order, procedure, and the clear, unambiguous hierarchy of rank. His authority in this tent was absolute, radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He was the gatekeeper of information, the master of the signals that were the lifeblood of the entire combat outpost. His men, a collection of young specialists with pale faces and the nervous energy of caged greyhounds, orbited him with a mixture of fear and reverence. He was their mentor, their tyrant, their god of the machine. His patrol of his domain was a ritual. He moved with a heavy, deliberate tread, his boots clanging on the raised metal flooring with a rhythm that announced his approach long before he was seen. He would pause behind a young airman, his shadow falling over the screen, his presence a silent, suffocating judgment on the soldier's work. He would point a thick, calloused finger at a line of code, his voice a low growl that could curdle milk. "Recalibrate that uplink, specialist. You're getting a 2 decibel signal degradation. In this house, we operate on a zero-fail standard." The specialist would flinch, his fingers fumbling on the keyboard, sweat beading on his brow. Miller would watch for a moment longer, his lip curling in a faint sneer of satisfaction, before moving on. This was how the world worked. This was how excellence was forged. Through pressure, through fear, through the unyielding application of his will. He was not here to be liked. He was here to ensure that when the moment came, his systems, his people would not break. It was a simple, brutal calculus that had served him well for 22 years. It was during one such patrol that his eyes fell upon the anomaly. Tucked away in a corner at an auxiliary diagnostic station that was rarely used, sat a woman. She was not one of his. He knew every face, every name, every weakness of the soldiers under his command. This woman was an outsider, a foreign object in his sterile environment. She was dressed in sterile, nondescript civilian clothes, a simple gray blouse, dark cargo pants, and worn-looking hiking boots. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and she wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing that might betray a hint of personality or vanity. She was staring intently at a small, deactivated data tablet in her hands, her expression one of placid concentration. She was so still, so utterly absorbed in her task, that she seemed to be drawing the very light and sound of the room into herself, creating a small pocket of absolute silence around her. To Miller, she looked less like a person and more like a piece of forgotten equipment. He stopped, his heavy boots making a final, definitive clang on the floor. The sound was meant to startle, to announce his presence as a challenge. The woman did not look up. She did not flinch. She did not even seem to register his existence. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, the hum of the servers filling the sudden expectant silence that had fallen over the nearby consoles. His specialists watched, their fingers frozen above their keyboards, sensing the impending collision of worlds. Miller felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. It was the anger of a king whose sovereignty had been casually, utterly ignored. He saw not a person, but a violation of his sacred space. He saw a civilian, soft and undisciplined, who had wandered into the heart of the war machine without a shred of the requisite fear or respect. And worse, she was a woman, which to his mind compounded the offense, adding a layer of fragility and cluelessness to her intrusion. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding. "Can I help you?" The woman's focus remained on the tablet. Without looking up, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was not a gesture of defiance, but one of simple, factual dismissal. Like a surgeon waving away a nurse who was offering the wrong instrument. The casualness of it was a slap in the face. It was more insulting than any shouted curse. It was the dismissal of a superior to an irrelevance. Miller's jaw tightened until the muscle bulged. He took a step closer, deliberately invading her personal space, forcing her to acknowledge the physical reality of his presence. His shadow now completely engulfed her. He leaned down, pitching his voice to carry across the room, ensuring his entire audience of subordinates could hear the lesson he was about to impart. "This is a restricted area," he began, his tone dripping with condescending patience, the kind one might use on a lost child. "This is the beating heart of this entire FOB. The equipment in here is sensitive. It's classified. It's not a library. It's not a break room for civilian contractors to come play on their little iPads." He gestured vaguely at the tablet in her hands. She still did not look up. Her focus remained absolute. A small muscle in her jaw twitched, the only sign that she had even heard him. The silence stretched, thick and charged. Miller's men stared, wide-eyed. They had never seen anyone, not even a commissioned officer, fail to respond to the master sergeant's direct address. It was like watching someone try to ignore a hurricane. He straightened up, his face now a mask of cold fury. The pretense of patience was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, indignant core of his ego. He was being made a fool of in his own house, in front of his own men. His authority, the very bedrock of his identity, was being eroded by this woman's inexplicable calm. "I gave you an order, ma'am," he said, the last word a deliberate insult, twisting a term of respect into a weapon. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes were a pale, dispassionate gray, like a winter sky. They held no fear, no anger, no surprise. They were the eyes of a scientist observing a curious but ultimately uninteresting specimen. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. Her gaze swept past him, taking in the entire room, the banks of servers, the anxious faces of the young soldiers, and then returned to settle on him. It was a look of pure, clinical assessment. "You did not give an order, Master Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, low-pitched, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was as calm and flat as her gaze. "You made a series of incorrect statements and then a request." The sheer, pedantic audacity of her correction stunned him into a momentary silence. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. The looks on his men's faces were a mixture of shock and a terrifying, nascent amusement. He had to crush this, now. He jabbed a finger toward her chest, his knuckles white. "Who do you think you are?" he snapped, his voice finally breaking free into a full-throated, parade-ground bark. "You're in my house. You're touching my gear. You don't have the proper clearance. I don't know who you are or what pencil-pushing department you crawled out of. But you will stand up. You will identify yourself. And you will explain to me why I shouldn't have you thrown in the brig for trespassing in a SCIF." It was the full display of his power, the final undeniable assertion of his dominance. He had laid out the charges, invoked the threat of military justice, and re-established the chain of command. He stood back, crossing his thick arms over his chest, waiting for the inevitable crumbling, the apologies, the fear. The woman's expression did not change. She was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance and snarl at the very edge of its kill radius, watching with a kind of detached, academic curiosity. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply held his gaze, her own unwavering and unnervingly calm. "I believe," she said, her voice still a quiet murmur that somehow cut through the hum of the room with the precision of a laser, "that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Then, she did the most infuriating thing of all. She looked back down at her tablet, her focus returning to it instantly and completely, as if he had ceased to exist. The dismissal was so total, so absolute, that it was a far more profound humiliation than any argument could ever be. He was a gnat she had brushed away. Miller was beyond rage. He was in a state of pure, incandescent fury. His entire worldview, built on the solid foundation of rank and respect, had been shattered by this small, quiet woman. He reached out, his hand closing around her shoulder, his intention to physically haul her from the chair. He would drag her out of his TOC if he had to. He would make an example of her that his men would talk about for years. His fingers made contact with the thin fabric of her blouse, and in that exact instant, the world ended. It began not with a bang, but with a color. Every one of the 24 monitors in the room, which a moment before had been displaying streams of green and amber data, flickered once and turned a uniform, blood red. It was a deep, visceral crimson, the color of a severed artery. For a full second, the only light in the room was this hellish, pulsing red glow, painting every face in a demonic mask. The constant, reassuring hum of the servers did not stop. It changed. The pitch rose, climbing up the scale into a high, keening whine of electronic agony. Then came the alarms. A cacophony of sirens erupted from every console, a layered shriek of digital panic. A synthesized voice, cold and robotic, began to chant a single, terrifying phrase over the intercom. "System compromise, system compromise, Aegis protocol failure, system compromise." Simultaneously, the physical world joined the assault. A low rumble started, a distant vibration that grew with terrifying speed. The metal floor began to tremble, and the canvas walls of the massive tent structure started to flap and pop with violent snaps. The lights overhead flickered wildly, then died, plunging the room into near total darkness, lit only by the hellish red of the dead screens and the frantic strobing of the emergency beacons. A roar built outside, a sound like a freight train pressing against the walls, the sound of the sky being torn apart. A haboob, a monster sandstorm, and it was on them. Panic, raw and undiluted, bloomed in the room like a toxic flower. Master Sergeant Miller's hand, which had been clamped on the woman's shoulder, fell away as he spun around, his mind struggling to process the simultaneous, multi-front catastrophe. His men were shouting, their voices thin and reedy against the roaring wind and the screaming alarms. "Sir, we've lost all satellite uplinks," one cried. "Main power is down. We're on emergency backup, but it's fluctuating," yelled another. "Firewalls 1 through 4 are gone. They didn't slow it down. They just evaporated. It's a cascading viral attack, sir. I've never seen anything like it. It's bypassing everything." Miller's mind, so accustomed to rigid procedure and linear problem-solving, was short-circuiting. The storm was an act of God, but the cyber attack was an act of war, and the two happening at once was an impossibility he couldn't comprehend. He barked orders, his voice tight with a fear he was desperately trying to conceal. "Get the hardlines back up. Reboot the primary servers. Somebody get me a damn sit rep. Follow the protocol. Run the damn checklist." But the checklists were useless. The protocols were written for threats they understood, for enemies who played by recognizable rules. This was something else. This was a decapitation strike aimed at the brain of the FOB, and it was succeeding. The red screens were a mocking tombstone for every system he was sworn to protect. The foundation of his world had turned to sand, both literally and figuratively. His authority, which had seemed so absolute just moments before, was now a meaningless shout in a hurricane of chaos. He was a king standing in the smoking ruins of his castle, and he had no idea what to do. The noise, the confusion, the sheer overwhelming terror of total failure was paralyzing him. And then, through the maelstrom, a new sound emerged. It was quiet, but it cut through the noise with impossible clarity. Click. It was the sound of the woman's data tablet being set down gently on the console. In the strobing, chaotic darkness, she rose from her chair. She did not rush. She did not panic. She moved with a fluid, economical grace, a terrifying calmness that seemed to bend the chaos around her. The storm howled, the alarms shrieked, the men shouted in fear, and she simply walked. She moved from the auxiliary station to the main command console, the very heart of the system that Miller had called his throne. Miller, frozen in indecision, watched her approach. "What are you doing?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Get away from there! You'll make it worse!" She did not answer him. She did not even look at him. She reached the main console, and for a moment, she just stood there, her hands hovering over the keyboard as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. The red screens cast her in a bloody light, but her face was a mask of serene, absolute focus. She was no longer an unassuming civilian. She was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful. Then her hands dropped to the keyboard, and the masterclass began. Her fingers did not type, they danced. They flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed physically impossible, a blur of motion that left Miller's best specialists looking like clumsy children. The staccato clatter of the keys was a new kind of music in the room, a sharp, defiant rhythm against the howling chaos. It was the sound of order being imposed upon anarchy by sheer force of will. A torrent of code began to scroll across the main screen, So fast it was unreadable, a waterfall of complex commands and algorithms that were a foreign language to everyone else in the room. She was not trying to reboot the system. She was rewriting it from the ground up, in real time, in the middle of a catastrophic failure. She began to speak. Her voice was the same, quiet and calm, but now it was imbued with an authority that dwarfed anything Miller had ever possessed. It was the authority of pure, undeniable competence. Her words were not suggestions or requests. They were imperatives, fired off like precision munitions. "Specialist Davies," she said, her eyes never leaving the screen. "The backup power is fluctuating because the storm is causing harmonic resonance in the primary conduits. Divert all cycle regulators to the secondary capacitor bank. You have a 17-second window before it cascades. Go." Davies, a young man who had been staring uselessly at a dead monitor, jumped as if struck by lightning. He didn't question the order. He didn't ask who she was. The sheer certainty in her voice was more compelling than any rank. He scrambled to his station, his hands flying across a physical control board. "Sergeant Chen," she continued, her fingers a blur. "The viral attack is a polymorphic ghost worm. It's not in the system. It's in the firmware of the routers themselves. It's rewriting their boot-level instructions. Standard firewalls are irrelevant. I need you to physically sever the connection to the primary satellite array. Not power down, sever. Use the emergency axe. You have 10 seconds. Chen, a hardened NCO, stared for a half-second. Then his eyes widened in dawning comprehension. He ripped an emergency axe from its housing on the wall and sprinted out of the room without a word. She was not just fixing the problem. She was seeing it, all of it, on a level they couldn't even conceive of. She saw the physical storm and the digital one not as two separate crises, but as a single, interconnected system. She was a conductor leading a symphony of chaos, turning each discordant note into a part of her composition. The red screens began to flicker, not with failure, but with her code. Lines of her green text battled against the red background, consuming it, rewriting it, healing it. One by one, the alarms began to fall silent. The high-pitched whine of the servers descended back to its normal, healthy hum. The emergency lights stopped strobing and settled into a steady, reliable glow. The men in the room had stopped shouting. They were standing or sitting in a state of silent, religious awe, watching her work. They had forgotten the storm raging outside. They had forgotten their fear. They were all, Miller included, simply witnesses. Master Sergeant Frank Miller stood rooted to the spot, his mouth hanging slightly open. Everything he thought he knew about command, about expertise, about power, was being dismantled before his eyes. He had built his career on the bedrock of the uniform, on the clear lines of the UCMJ, on the weight of the stripes on his sleeve. He had believed, with the faith of a zealot, that authority was granted by a piece of paper from the Department of Defense. But this woman, this quiet, unassuming civilian, wielded an authority that was elemental. It was not granted, it was inherent. It was the authority that came from being the only person in the world who knew what to do when the lights went out. He felt his own sense of self, his pride, his very identity, shrinking under the glare of her brilliance until it was a small, pathetic thing. He was not a king. He was a child who had been playing with his father's tools, and the master artisan had just walked into the room. In under 3 minutes, she had stabilized the internal network. The screens were no longer red, but a calm, steady green, filled with diagnostic data that was flowing smoothly. But they were still isolated. The storm and the attack had cut them off from the outside world. "We're stable, but we're deaf and blind," someone whispered. as if afraid to break the spell. The woman shook her head. "No," she said softly, her fingers still moving, but more slowly now, with a surgeon's delicate touch. "The enemy thinks we are. They use the storm as cover for their primary attack. They believe they've isolated this entire sector. They're getting ready for a physical assault. But they made a mistake." She typed one final, elegant line of code and hit enter. They assumed our only link was through the satellite array. A new window opened on the main screen. It was a topographical map of the region. A single, pulsating red dot appeared on it, miles away, deep in the mountain range that bordered the valley. "The worm they used had a fatal flaw," she explained, her voice still a clinical monotone. "It was designed to report its success back to its controller. When Sergeant Chen severed the SAT link, it sought another pathway. It found one. A quantum-entangled comms experiment I've been running through the bedrock. A ghost signal. It's supposed to be impossible to detect." She paused. "But I designed the lock, so I know how to build the key." She pointed a single, steady finger at the red dot on the screen. "There they are," she said. "The point of origin for the entire attack. Their command and control. And they have no idea we can see them." A profound silence descended upon the room, deeper even than the one that had preceded the chaos. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting. It was the silence of minds being blown. She had not just defended them. She had not just fixed the system. She had turned the enemy's greatest weapon into their own undoing. She had handed them victory from the jaws of absolute defeat. It was into this sacred silence that a new sound intruded. The thumping, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades, fighting against the gale force winds of the dying storm. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was directly overhead, shaking the very structure of the TOC. A moment later, the main flap was thrown open, and a figure burst in, framed by the swirling dust and the glare of the helicopter's landing lights. He was tall and lean, wearing the flight suit of a Black Hawk pilot, but the 2 stars on his collar glittered in the dim light of the tent. It was General Wallace, the theater commander himself. He was followed by 2 heavily armed guards. His face was a mask of grim urgency. The storm had clearly forced him down at their FOB, the only island of stability in a sea of chaos. "Report!" he boomed, his voice accustomed to cutting through the noise of battlefields and boardrooms. "My entire command network just went dark. Every comms link in this sector is down. What in God's name is happening here?" His eyes scanned the room, landing on Master Sergeant Miller, the highest-ranking NCO present. Miller, still reeling, could only stammer. "Sir, we were hit. A massive cyber attack, and the storm—" General Wallace's eyes narrowed. He had no time for excuses. His gaze swept the room again, searching, his expression growing more desperate. "My pilot said he saw a flicker of a signal from this location, an old classified emergency channel. I need to speak to the person in charge here. Now!" Before Miller could attempt another pathetic response, the general's frantic search stopped. His eyes locked onto the small, quiet woman who was now standing calmly by the main console, watching him with her unnervingly placid gray eyes. The general's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The frantic urgency vanished, replaced by a look of profound, almost stunned relief. The hard lines of his face softened. He straightened his back, not out of aggression, but out of a sudden reflexive deference. "Oracle," he breathed, the name a strange mixture of a code word and a prayer. "Thank God. It's you." He took a step forward, And then he did something that sent a shockwave through the room. Something that shattered the last remaining pillar of Frank Miller's understanding of the world. General Wallace, a two-star commander, a man who commanded armies and answered only to the Pentagon, snapped his heels together and threw the sharpest, most respectful salute Miller had ever seen. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a superior officer. It was the salute one gives to a legend, to royalty. "Ma'am," the general said, his voice now filled with a deep, reverent respect. "Director Thorne, I should have known you'd be here." The name descended into the silent room like a physical weight. Director Thorne. The title hung in the air, charged with meaning that the specialists could only guess at, but that Miller, in a sickening flash of insight, was beginning to understand. The woman, Heiress Thorne, simply gave the general a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one sovereign power to another. "General," she said, "your network is secure. I've contained the threat. Furthermore, I've located the source of the attack. I'm transmitting the coordinates to your pilot's flight computer now. I suspect your special operations teams will want to act on this intelligence immediately." She turned back to the console, typed a few commands, and the data was sent. It was all done with the same quiet, devastating efficiency. General Wallace held his salute for a moment longer before slowly lowering his hand. He looked around the room, at the stunned faces of the communications specialists, and then his eyes finally settled on Master Sergeant Frank Miller. The general's gaze, which had been filled with reverence for Thorne, now turned to ice. He had seen the entire tableau the moment he walked in. The disheveled, panicked Master Sergeant and the calm, commanding civilian who was clearly running the show. He didn't know the details of what had transpired before the attack, but he could guess. "Master Sergeant," Wallace said, his voice dangerously quiet, "were you aware that you had Director Thorne, the lead architect of the entire Aegis Strategic Communications Network, the very system you are paid to operate, sitting in your facility?" Miller's face went white. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty, grayish pallor. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, a feeling far worse than the fear he had felt during the attack. This was the fear of career-ending, soul-crushing humiliation. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could only shake his head, a pathetic, trembling motion. The architect, not a contractor, not an analyst, the creator, the god of the machine he had so arrogantly claimed as his own, he had threatened to throw God out of her own church. General Wallace stared at him for a long, brutal moment, letting the full weight of his failure settle in. Then he turned his back on Miller, a gesture of complete and utter dismissal, and addressed Thorne again. "Director, anything you need is yours. My bird, my men, this entire FOB, just give the order." Thorne looked from the general back to the shell-shocked Master Sergeant. Her pale gray eyes held no triumph, no anger, no satisfaction. There was only that same unwavering, clinical assessment. The crisis was over. The enemy was located. The system was secure. Now all that remained was the final, most delicate part of the operation. The reckoning. She took a slow step toward Master Sergeant Miller, who flinched as if she were about to strike him. The other soldiers in the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the thunderous dressing down, the public evisceration that Miller so richly deserved. They expected her to yell, to demand he be stripped of his rank, to exercise the immense power she so clearly possessed. But Heiress Thorne did not raise her voice. She stopped a few feet from him and simply looked at him, her gaze analytical, as if she were diagnosing a faulty piece of hardware. When she finally spoke, her voice was still quiet, but it carried an immense weight, the weight of a truth that could not be denied. Your failure today was not one of technical incompetence, Master Sergeant, she began, her tone that of a professor conducting a post-mortem on a failed experiment. Your men are well trained in the procedures you have taught them. Your systems, before the attack, were running at 99.8% efficiency. By the book, you are an excellent manager of this facility. She paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air for a moment before cutting it down. Your failure was tactical. It was a failure of intelligence, of situational awareness, of the most fundamental principle of warfare. Know your terrain. And in this domain, she swept a hand around the room of servers and consoles. Terrain is not just the equipment, it is the human assets within it. Miller stared at her, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This was worse than being yelled at. This was a dissection. You looked at me, and you did not see an asset, she continued, her voice relentlessly calm. You saw a category, a civilian, a woman, an anomaly that did not fit your rigidly defined parameters of what a person of value looks like in this environment. You made an assumption based on my clothing and my gender, and that assumption nearly cost this entire base its operational integrity. Your prejudice, Master Sergeant, is a critical security vulnerability. It is a bigger flaw than any line of bad code or any unpatched server. Every word was a perfectly placed blow, dismantling his pride, his career, his very sense of self. He was not just wrong, he was a liability. His greatest strengths, his adherence to protocol, his belief in the hierarchy, had been revealed as his most profound weaknesses. General Wallace watched, his expression grim. He expected Thorne to demand Miller's removal, his court-martial. It was what he would have done. But Thorne was not interested in conventional punishment. Punishment was easy. It was an end. She was interested in education, in fixing the flaw. She turned to the general. General Wallace, I will not require a formal reprimand for the Master Sergeant. It would be inefficient. The word hung in the air, a final, damning assessment of Miller's worldview. Instead, I require a temporary reassignment. With your permission, I am requisitioning Master Sergeant Miller for the next 6 months. He will serve as my personal technical liaison. A collective, muffled gasp went through the room. Miller looked at her, his expression a mask of pure confusion and terror. Her personal liaison? It sounded like a death sentence. Thorne's gaze returned to Miller, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something behind her gray eyes. It wasn't malice. It was the focused intensity of a teacher about to begin a very difficult lesson. You will learn, Master Sergeant, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. You will learn the architecture of this system, not from a manual, but from its source code. You will learn the name and function of every chip on every board. You will learn quantum mechanics and signal theory. You will learn to see the electromagnetic spectrum as a physical space. And while you are learning, you will also be responsible for my coffee, my travel arrangements, and ensuring my equipment is calibrated to my exact specifications. You will learn competence from the ground up, and you will learn that true authority is not worn on a sleeve. It is demonstrated in action. The lesson begins now. My tablet needs charging. She turned and walked back to the auxiliary console, picked up the small data tablet that had started the entire confrontation, and held it out to him. For a long moment, Frank Miller just stood there, his world completely remade, He was a master sergeant in the United States Air Force, a senior NCO with 22 years of decorated service. And he was being ordered to charge a tablet. He looked at the device in her hand. He looked at her calm, expectant face. He looked at General Wallace, who gave him a single, sharp nod that said, "This is not a request." Slowly, his movements stiff and robotic, he reached out and took the tablet from her. His hand, which had held a rifle in combat, which had signed off on million-dollar requisitions, which had shaken the hands of congressmen, trembled as it closed around the smooth, cool plastic. He turned, his back ramrod straight out of pure, ingrained reflex, and walked toward a charging station. The king had been humbled. His re-education had begun. The story of what happened that day in the TOC at FOB Peregrine passed into legend. It became a fable told in hushed, reverent tones at the Signals Intelligence School at Goodfellow Air Force Base, a cautionary tale for young, arrogant technicians who thought they knew everything. The details, as they always do, grew with each telling. The sandstorm became a supernatural tempest. The cyber attack became the work of a mythical foreign genius. And Dr. Eris Thorne, the quiet woman in gray, became a ghost, a legend known only as the Oracle, the hidden master of the digital battlefield. They said she could hear the whispers of electrons and that she wrote code like poetry. They said her name was spoken in the highest, most classified corridors of power, a name that could launch fleets and stop wars. And what of Master Sergeant Frank Miller? He did not break. He did not quit. For 6 agonizing, humbling months, he served as Director Thorne's shadow. He carried her Pelican cases across tarmacs in 3 different continents. He learned to calibrate a quantum entanglement transceiver until he could do it in his sleep. He sat in on briefings with generals and defense ministers, a silent, invisible figure pouring coffee, his ears open, his mind absorbing everything. He watched her debate theoretical physicists and deconstruct the work of a dozen PhDs. He saw her work for 36 hours straight, fueled by nothing but cold coffee and sheer intellect, to avert a crisis that the world would never even know had happened. He learned. He learned about technology, yes, but he learned more about humility. He learned that the world was infinitely more complex than his rigid chain of command had ever allowed for. He learned that competence, true, undeniable competence, was a force of nature that transcended rank, uniform, gender, or any other superficial metric. He learned to see the person first, not the container they came in. Years later, Chief Master Sergeant Frank Miller stood before a lecture hall of fresh-faced airmen, the future of his career field. He was a different man. The hard, arrogant edges had been worn away, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that was earned, not assumed. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, but his eyes held a wisdom that was new, a depth that had not been there before. He was one of the most respected instructors in the entire command, known for his encyclopedic knowledge and his unnerving ability to see potential where others saw nothing. He would always end his first lecture to a new class the same way. He would lean against the podium, his gaze sweeping across the young, eager faces before him. "I'm going to tell you a story," he would begin, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "It's about the biggest mistake I ever made in my life. It's about a day I confused the stripes on my sleeve with actual knowledge. It's about a quiet woman and a very loud storm." And he would tell them the whole story. He would not spare himself. He would paint the picture of his own arrogance, his own prejudice, his own spectacular public failure. He would describe the red screens, the howling wind, the terror of his own incompetence. And he would describe the quiet, unassuming woman who, with nothing but her intellect, had single-handedly saved them all. He made himself the cautionary tale. He turned his greatest humiliation into his most powerful teaching tool. "Look around you," he would conclude, his voice dropping, forcing the students to lean in. "In this room, in the field, in your life, you will encounter people who do not fit the mold. They will not look like you. They will not talk like you. They will not wear the uniform you wear. Your first instinct will be to dismiss them, to judge them based on the cover, not the contents. I am here to tell you that this instinct is a fatal flaw. It is a bug in your own personal code. The most brilliant, most capable, most important person in the room is very often the one who is quietest. They do not need to boast. They do not need to posture. Their competence is their argument. Your job is not to challenge them. Your job is to shut your mouth, open your eyes, and have the humility to recognize true mastery when you are lucky enough to be in its presence. Let your actions be your only authority, and let your respect be given to skill, not to rank. That is the only lesson that matters. The legend of the Oracle was a story about a hidden master, a powerful woman who moved through the shadows of the world's most secret conflicts. But the legacy of Chief Master Sergeant Miller was, in its own way, just as powerful. It was the living proof that the most profound lessons are not learned in victory, but in the humbling grace of total defeat, and that the best teachers are often those who are willing to admit that once they knew nothing at all. True strength was not the refusal to be humbled, but the wisdom to be transformed by it.